Hi, this is Paul. As you can see, I'm not in my usual place. I'm out of town for the graduation of my youngest son. Synod has just ended, and it was a synod that I don't think will soon be forgotten. There's going to be a lot to talk about after this synod. I think I'm going to talk right now about Wednesday. I finished watching all of the Wednesday video last night, and my goal is to try to get a sense of the day. I've got some Wi-Fi connectivity here, but I by no means have the bandwidth to upload a lot of content, and maybe that's for the best. The Christian Reformed Church is in a slow-moving, painful divorce. The CRCNA, the Christian Reformed Church, is in some ways the best sort of family that cannot escape her specific misery. She is careening for what may be an inevitable divorce, but she is doing her level best to try to avoid it. And that misery really came to a head on Wednesday night. As I laid through in my previous videos, the advisory committees meet, and the advisory committees are small samples of what comes to the floor. Part of what was notable from Advisory Committee 7 was many people mentioned on the floor that the experience that they had, the spiritual experience that they had, was something that they would remember all their lives. It was an incredibly moving, powerful experience to be on that committee, to be with 20 some odd people in a room and to wrestle with these things together face to face. Part of what makes this so difficult is that all of that face-to-face processing is in service of a judicial decision, let's call it that, where there's choosing yes and no, where there's decisions about structures, where there's decisions about the future. One of the things that you'll notice if you watch the Synod videos is that there's a tremendous amount of worship, and the music is beautiful. There's a tremendous amount of prayer. The Christian Reformed Church is employing all that it can to try to keep the body together, while at the same time doing their best to honestly represent the sincere beliefs and practices of the diversity of churches that they come from. As mentioned in earlier videos, the Christian Reformed Church has tried to strive for racial diversity and ethnic diversity, but it's difficult to know how all the diversities overlap and what they all mean. And so in many ways, the advisory committees are sort of fractals of the far larger body. And they are not sort of necessarily selected as, let's say, I'm not saying anything against the delegates, the brightest and the best. I caught Jacob's live stream the other night with Phlebas, where they were talking about Synod. And it's not the people at the top of all the hierarchies that do this. As I mentioned in my Mr. Smith Goes to Washington or Reverend Vanderploeg Goes to Synod video, Synod is full of randos, and that's part of her glory. It's a very Protestant thing. It's the regular people of the church, delegated, representing, to try to deliberate and to do the work of the church together. And in a time of conflict and transition like our own, that's extremely difficult. And I think people are really doing their best to bring their best selves to that place, and at the same time represent what they truly believe and do the work of the Lord with all of the differences that apply for each of them given their different circumstances. Now, the Christian Reformed Church has its roots as an immigrant church, and as I mentioned in my earlier video about burning the wooden shoes, over the last 50 years, the church has increasingly become an American church. I got a phone call right in the middle, and it was a 616 number, which is, of course, Western Michigan, so I picked it up, and it was a synodical delegate driving home. Yeah, the CRC has its roots as an immigrant church, and for many, the church is quite literally an extended family thing. It's nowhere near the extended family that it was in the 1970s and before, but it's a big deal, and people have given their all for this church multi-generationally. And so all of this is enormously painful for people, and it's enormously difficult. I will have to talk about Thursday at some point. I don't know if I'll have time to do it this weekend. Like I said, I'm out of town. Family is gathering to celebrate a graduation, and I still have my sermon to finish. So I've got stuff in the can for the YouTube stream, but I will be preaching on Sunday. But yeah, there's a lot of emotion going through a lot of Christian Reformed people right now. And I think all up and down, it's conflicted. I think up through Wednesday, it seemed like basically sort of a pretty consistent conservative victory. And then Thursday happened, and of course, we'll have to talk about that. Committee 7, which dealt with the Human Sexuality report from last year and all of the overtures that came as a response of it. As I mentioned, many in that committee said that the experience that they had of working together was one of the most incredible spiritual experiences of their lives. In the end, they couldn't have a completely unified report. They did break into two groups, and it was in some ways, again, sort of a fractal of the larger body. And to have it be right there on the floor of Synod was a powerful day. Committee 7 used all of their relational resources to create a mountaintop spiritual environment, only to find it was not enough to resolve their differences. And then there was this moment, and I'm going to simply drop the video into here and just let it play, because in many ways this moment typified Wednesday, and this was sort of the salient moment that showed everybody the way it was.
Thank you, David. We have Rita, then Herb, and then Matt from Lake Erie.
Rita Klein-Gelting, classes Quinty. I have a question for the majority committee, and I think I know the answer. Actually, 4 questions, but I know the answer, but because otherwise I wouldn't have signed the minority report. If this passes, can someone who is unsure of what God expects of LGBTQ peoples, can that unsure person become a member of the CRC? Question 2, can someone who is unsure become an office bearer in the Christian Reformed Church, in our churches? Number 3, can someone who is unsure sign a gravamen? Is that okay? I've been a member of the Christian Reformed Church all my life, as my husband and our parents and my 4 sons, my 4 boys, who are, Karen knows they're men, and their wives are all following Jesus and are members of the Christian Reformed Church. My 12 grandchildren are members of the Christian Reformed Church. If my 4 sons and their wives fall into this category of unsure, can the CRC still be their home? You may answer the question.
No, I know. No, Rita, that's fine. We were in committee together. I bless you. We worked together. I'll try and answer as best I can. Maybe not so much in the technical manner of things.
Come to order, folks. Give some space here. Give some space.
At 5:30 this evening, we adjourned. I think it was 5:35. And I jumped in my vehicle and I drove to a sports bar down the street, had ice water with lemon. And here I am, a 55-year-old guy sitting in the corner in a sweater, crying. I love this church. I've been a member all my life. I love preaching for this church. I love teaching in this church. I love its confessions. I wouldn't be standing here tonight if I didn't love these confessions. But what griefs me so bad is that we make decisions here and then we leave here and some decide to be ogres about it, jerks about it. And we can't even hold to a confession. We gotta be jerks about it. Please, so Rita, I hear your heart. Yes, Willem, it is a yes and no question. No. Let me try and put it this way. And if I'm out of order, say so. If you're going to vote for this majority report, please don't leave here and be a jerk about it. And to those who are opposed to this report, not all of us hate LGBT people. Okay? Sorry. I'm sorry. So, yes, I want to believe, Rita, those who have questions, who are unsure, have a place, and we're not jerks about it, and we can find a way to converse. But please understand, I love these confessions, and we could do this. We could hold the truth and bring people along in the truth, and they can see Christ in us. I don't know. I realize that probably doesn't specifically answer your question. I'm just speaking to the heart of what we're trying to talk about here. So I apologize.
Stuck couples often cannot always find a way out of their misery, and in some ways that's sort of where the Christian Reformed Church is right now. Powerful realities are aligned against their union, and I can diagnose it, but I can't resolve it. And so what comes now are a few thoughts about the dynamics that I noted through the course of the whole day Wednesday. And again, depending on interest and how the conversation keeps going, I might do a deeper dive into Wednesday. It was an important day, but Thursday was important too, and we will have to talk about Thursday. There's obviously a difference of belief beneath the two perspectives, and for over a decade now, I've been calling us to a confessional conversation, and we're clearly having one. I'm not sure how well we're doing with it yet. There are signs of hope that perhaps we are doing it better. A confessional conversation is to help the church basically find not only the lines of the reasons over which they disagree, those are obvious, but the much deeper roots beneath those lines so they can better understand how to organize their wineskins and how to be church together, and how different parts of the church can relate to one another despite differences. This has been happening nearly right from the start in the church. And sort of the pressure to hold them together is, of course, John 17, and you'll hear that brought up again and again during Synod. Again, the CRC is trying its best to not have this difference, not divide it. Best to have this difference, not divide it. But the question is whether that cost is too high. And that's what many are weighing right now. What is the cost? Where are the priorities? What are the hierarchies? How are we supposed to make these decisions and come to the judgments about the people around us? The CRC has tried this with women in church office, and in the 1990s accepted basically a political compromise that led to the departure of around 60,000 church members and launched a few smaller denominations, that some of which are still around. And as Sean Baker noted in the video where we talked about some of these things, the echo of that trauma is a word that likes to be used right now, I will call that trauma, to the church still remains. And that trauma from the women in church office continues to impact this conversation. But these issues are not identical. And a lot of times we look for analogies in order to sort of navigate. And this is how we're trying to navigate. And there's some things you can learn. In some ways there are similarities. In some ways there are differences. Worldviews matter in this framing. Whether or not same-sex, the deep divide, and this is one way to put it, but it's by no means the only way. Same-sex attraction is a violation of God's good order, or same-sex attraction is a natural variant in humanity. And so much larger worldview conflicts that have been around since the modernist fundamentalist fights are still sort of beneath the surface here. And they don't necessarily cut one way or the other. Both sides both resist those forces and appeal to them in making their arguments. Is it something that can be tolerated, can be accommodated, can be lived with, or must be continually resisted? And I could just go through speech after speech after speech, and you can just hear these issues just reverberating on both sides. Culturally, by virtue of the way arguments have been made for the last 10 years, people want to point to identity and representation to sort of get out of it. And that breaks down quickly, because once, let's say, you say, well, it's lived experience of being same-sex attracted, you can immediately point to someone who is same-sex attracted and doesn't come to an affirming conclusion, and vice versa. And so a lot of these ways to try to get out of the dilemmas are not working the way people want them to, and yet they continue to be appealed towards, and they continue to not have the impact with others that perhaps these arguments had 5 or 10 years ago. Now, to avoid the divorce, the CRC is desperately looking for common ground, and this is where a couple of issues and some of the ways that we're relating to each other, we really have to sort of take a step back and look at. With all of the pain and the trauma of this ecclesiastical divorce that is feared and quite likely imminent, people are looking for comfort, people are looking for common ground, people are looking for ways and reasons to avoid the divorce. And again, in a marriage, especially a marriage with children, this is the kind of thing that absolutely tries the soul of an unhappy couple. Now, one of the things that you'll see on the floor of Synod are collective and communal confession. One individual, this was actually in the Thursday meeting, talked about Well, there's all sorts of analogies that fly. And the reason we use analogies is because we hope with a question that we can't easily sort of find our way through, we hope that analogies will sort of guide the way. And we have to use analogies. Analogies are foundational to our thought process, to our language process. Language is itself in some ways almost completely metaphorical. And so analogies are powerful. And there's a sense of confession. And so one of the things that you hear, and this was very clear in the very moving, united Committee 7, the Committee 7 preamble, which was a moving document. It was something that both sides could agree to. And so when both sides found their agreement in this, which was basically confession, then in the past we've not done well. So maybe we're fighting over how to regard the issue now, but in the past we have not done well, and we can both agree to that. And so in those moments, the two sides can come together and look at each other. And again, it's almost like a couple saying, okay, we've got this horrendous fight and these horrendous issues that are pulling us apart, but in this one area we can be together. And doesn't it feel good just to be together? And being together for this confession of past error, let's say, gives us comfort and solace and healing. And the fact that it's a confession is not arbitrary either, because if both sides can sort of offer this joint confession, they can in some ways at least give the hope of absolution. And that's so foundational here. And so it also gives them a sense of joint mission. So mission and vindication on now being on the right side of history. So we've done these grievous things in the past. Now we see clearly, even though we still have this conflict, now we're together on this. So let's focus that. Let's put a lot of energy in that. Let's really try to make that moment count and stay, and then maybe we can get over the other. Together we can agree that wrongs have been done, and we'll all say that. Maybe we can avoid the divorce. But this safe harbor has a bitter pill. And I think for me, that's something that I saw most clearly at the end of Wednesday's deliberations, especially Wednesday night. Now, in the videos that I make that most CRC people haven't watched, there's been a moral alignment that's been going on between the church and Christendom beyond it. That is significant for the story of the West over the last 500 years, and particularly salient over the last 150 years, especially since sort of the Darwinian. Part of what happened in the modernist fundamentalist fight is that going into the scientific revolution and especially going into all of the discoveries of the 19th century about geology and Darwin, all of this sort of broke the church apart. Before that, the church sort of looked at the Bible and said, we can trust the Bible for history and morality. And part of what the modernist fundamentalist fight was over was the modernists basically said, we're skeptical about the Bible for history, but we can trust it for morality and ethics. And in that way, the beginning of modernism sort of had that bargain. And of course, fundamentalism sort of doubles down and says, no, it's really, really historical, and we can trust it for ethics. And that tension continues. And in many ways, that tension continued in the West into the Cold War and through the Cold War. But by the end of the Cold War, you had the rise of the new atheists. And again, I've run through this argument in some of my previous videos. Now, even during the Cold War, when there was at least a sense of alignment between the church and its Bible and the morality of the culture beyond it, there was sort of an intensification, sort of a two-speed moral situation between the church and society. People in the church were considered moral, but maybe a little too prudish, maybe a little too persnickety when it comes to sexuality or other moral aspects. But still there was alignment, but there was an intensification. And you can see this still in the case of adultery. When no-fault divorce came around, basically the government said, we're stepping out of the decisions about morality with respect to ending marriages. And so that, even in the church today, adultery is not tolerated, and especially clergy will be held accountable for moral lapses or moral failures. The divorce and remarriage can be a process by which there is maybe reconciliation, but even over the last 20 years, the Christian Reformed Church has doubled down on safety. And so you get these strange ironies where, and these were present in the Synod. I haven't talked about the Code of Conduct yet. Because on one hand, we're at a time when the safetyism in our culture is really leading towards, okay, accountability. We need to hold people with power accountable. Oh, okay. But at the same time, you have this openness with regard to sexuality and sort of the combination of sexuality and identity, which has a loosening. And so we've been having this, Ben Van de Zandt used to have this great phrase, you can't suck and blow at the same time. And if code of conduct is about sucking in to fortify ourselves, a lot of what's been happening on the sexual front is blowing to relieve ourselves. And you can't suck and blow at the same time. And we've been trying to do this as a synod. So you'd hear speech after speech after speech about centralization and then liberty. And what you'd find is that the two sides just keep switching positions with respect to them. Let's say the side that's more to the affirming, well, they want the code of conduct. We want accountability. And the other side says, no, we have local jurisdiction and leadership. And so the compromise is basically reached there. But then with the other position, they flip around to the other way. And again, as Ben Van de Zandt used to say, you can't suck and blow at the same time. It just doesn't work. And so basically what we're doing is hyperventilating as a denomination. Now what happened is that the broader Western liberal culture embraced sort of the natural variant model. And over the last 10 years, some of the most powerful influence machinery, this is again part of the irony of all of these power conversations, the most powerful influential influence machinery in the culture has been pushing the natural variant model now really since the 70s. And well, this has been forming people outside the church. And you add that with the intensification dynamic that happens between church and culture. Those who are, let's say, liberal within the church feel a lot of pressure because the church seems to be a lagging indicator of public morality instead of a vanguard, which the church wants to be. And you flip that around, and at the same time, that energizes. This is why, again, the Christian Reformed Church has been and will continue to get more conservative. Lyle Shaler pointed this out years ago in his early studies with respect to church growth. Countercultural churches always have stronger dynamics. Their groups are more passionate. They give more money. Countercultural groups strengthen. And so the Christian Reformed Church, in its aspect, because it's sort of divided, it's assimilating between mainline and evangelical, it's the countercultural elements are intensifying and strengthening within the Christian Reformed Church. I've made videos about this before, and again, this is why the Christian Reformed Church is and is going to continue to get more conservative, particularly on certain matters like this one. If you know anything about Aaron Renn's negative world thesis, that's what's happening here. Now, there are always two strategies for moral improvement, and both sides use both. They tend to use them at different times, and they tend to use them from different people, but both sides use both. There's the hard and the soft. Now, hard strategies for moral improvement tend to use a lot of different words. Marginalize. Now, marginalize sort of has a negative connotation in the culture, but one of the hard methods to bring about moral improvement is to marginalize, to deplatform, to cancel, to take a group that you believe is pushing the culture in a bad direction and marginalize them. Now, again and again, when you hear people, sort of the left tends to use this word, marginalized people, and there's sort of a sacred list of categories of people that are in these marginalized people. But of course, if you have a culture war like we're having now, people who in the past perhaps had power in the culture, as the culture war goes on and as they lose in their culture war, they are increasingly marginalized. Their candidates are no longer elected. Their perspectives are no longer granted the airwaves. Their positions lead to people getting canceled and deplatformed on social media. And the momentum happens with that. That's part of sort of the hard method of moral improvement. There's censure, where people are called out. There's shame. You ought to be ashamed of yourself. And you know, many of the, and again, I'm not saying these are bad or good. You know, a lot of these hard methods were employed to great degree and great success, and in my opinion, in a helpful way. Let's say the fight against racism that really happened in America after the Second World War in the 50s and 60s and 70s. And churches continue to use these, governments use these, cultures use these are used in culture war. So you have sort of hard strategies of moral improvement: to marginalize, to censor, to shame, to hold accountable, to punish, to discipline, etc. Now, when you hear this, keep this dynamic in mind when you listen to especially Thursday, because even these two means have a degree of moral valence between them. So there's the hard strategy of moral improvement, then there's the soft strategy of moral improvement: to admonish, to influence, to persuade, to win with love. And of course, within Christianity, Jesus, in fact, doesn't take up armed revolt against the Roman occupying forces of God's holy land and God's holy people. Jesus really moves the world with soft methods, okay? And so I think, generally speaking, part of how Christianity has conquered has often been putting soft methods over hard, but that doesn't mean that hard methods are always off the table with respect to Christianity. And in some ways, you see the soft methods in the Gospels, and you see the hard methods in the book of Revelation. All right? So both of them are in the Bible. And our view during church history, you know, very much is a debate on that. And this is an ongoing conversation within Christianity. Now, again, almost everybody uses both. The ratios with which they use both often differ with respect to temperament. Some people are just by temperament more people who tend to major in soft moral improvement. Other people more hard moral improvement. If you can look at the Big Five personality profile, people who are high in conscientiousness tend to major in hard. People who are high in openness tend to major in soft, etc., etc. Now, the hard approach lives in a moral economy with justification. Usually the hard approaches will be justified by certain arguments about, well, these people have done this, this is what we need to do, this is the moral environment we're living in, okay? So you have to keep the hard and the soft in play if you're going to understand how in some ways the CRC is in a really difficult relational trap with itself that is making it difficult to process, you heard this a few times to manage this conflict. Now, we should observe that the moral evolution story is a rider, and you will hear this again and again on the floor of Synod. You'll hear this on the internet. You'll hear this in social media. The argument basically says this, that there's a shared history of the heart. And remember when I said the introduction, the preface to Committee 7's report was that's the combined report. We can all look at the past and say, we've made mistakes. We've made mistakes with respect to racism. We've made mistakes with respect to sexism. We've made mistakes with respect to the way we've treated LGBTQ, same-sex attracted individuals. And that's clear in the 1973 report. And many people reference the 1973 report. Now, we changed our mind on racial social Darwinianism. Now, in my recent conference with John Vervaeke and Jonathan Pajot, we made an observation. Jonathan Pajot made an observation with respect to the past and the future. And I'm going to rephrase it this way, because we're talking about the relationship, let's say, between the book of Revelation and our reading of the book of Genesis. Now, be careful with this modernist fundamentalist fight here, because I'm going to make a broader argument that, generally speaking, this eschatological framework that we tend to project into the future, we also tend to project into the past. And you see this often, because often it's imagined that, well, racism is just something that has always been bad, and it's just slowly getting better through time. So you have this sort of bias of progressiveness that, well, things are always sort of getting better through time. This is sort of the eschatological framework. You have the post-mills that believe everything's going to improve slowly up until the coming of the kingdom. You have the pre-mills that often believe everything's going to get worse and worse and worse until Jesus interrupts it. Then you have the ah-mills that are kind of floundering in the middle and saying, well, some things are getting better, some things are getting worse. It's really tough to make those kind of judgments and arrangements. It's helpful to remember that racism builds on a bias within human beings for in-groups. And it's very easy for racial, and of course, racism is often impacted by globalism. When you have people in fairly homogeneous groups where you don't have a lot of racial characteristics distinguishing them, those groups will find other characteristics to differentiate themselves between in-groups and out-groups. Let's imagine Aboriginals or let's just say Native Americans in North America before the Columbian Exchange. They found all sorts of ways to fight against each other and to kill each other and to enslave each other. They had things that they had in common and they had things that they had apart, but tribalism, in-group, out-group dynamics is very clear with us. Part of what happens in the 19th century with the rise of Darwinism is very quickly social Darwinism comes on its heels, and this becomes a very powerful factor in racism. It's a big long thing, but we tend to look at the past with this sort of eschatological mode, and often people are like, well, it was just all racism until the civil rights movement. It doesn't really hold. Certainly racism was around. The Christian Reformed Church position on racism is that it is in fact endemic and will continue to be so. But that doesn't mean that there aren't certain different ways that people go about it. Now, you hear a lot of arguments on the floor that, well, bias against same-sex attracted individuals is basically the same as racism, and all of those lines should sort of follow. So we should embrace the new naturalistic model with same-sex attraction. The results are obvious. It gets better if you adopt our model. You might make an argument. I would argue, it's a complex thing, and I don't want to necessarily get too deep into it. I could in another forum, but it's helpful to remember that the naturalism that intensified racism has also been employed in this argument, especially in the born that way argument. And the Born That Way argument is actually losing ground and has been losing ground over the last decade. But the argument is openness, greater openness is better. And for myself, I think there's a lot of truth to that. I wouldn't really want, I think having greater openness. I mean, it's remarkable that you have same-sex attracted individuals on the floor of Synod basically telling their stories in a public way and receiving support. I think that is a positive that the gay liberation movement has given us. And that's my opinion. But there are some deep complexities within this narrative, but most run with it in a popular low-resolution mode, sort of in an eschatological low-resolution mode. And that's important, again, with respect to this bitter pill. And this arose at the end of the day when Stanley Jim and Wayne Coleman stood up, because suddenly, because of the rider on that narrative, all of these things sort of come together. And again, as human beings, we're always trying to simplify. I don't need these in. We're always trying to simplify our narratives and have them make sense for us. We're always trying to compress and simplify the world. So if we can just sort of clump all these people together, well, then it all makes sense. Listen to Wayne Coleman's words at the end. Listen to Stanley Jim's words there. They're basically making the argument, these things aren't really all the same. They're not really all the same. Historically, they're not the same, and they don't play out in the same way. And again, as I've said, sort of the immutability argument of Born That Way has basically been nuanced quite a bit. And it doesn't mean that it's never true, but a lot of the adjustment strategies have been built on the assumption that it must be true in the same way, so that let's say that Stanley Jim will be Navajo, period, or Wayne Coleman will be African American, period. The cultural conversation has moved on, not in the CRC, and this is part of what's going to be a problem for the affirming side, and part of the reason that I don't really think they've done enough confessional work. The traditionalists have an advantage in that they can much more easily sort of inherit a lot of confessional work and maybe adjust it with some confession. But the affirming side has a lot more work to do. And what's happening now in the culture is that things are moving so quickly with liberationism, with transhumanism, and with Gnosticism that basically says that there is the relationship between the material substrate and the person on top is increasingly tenuous, and that I can be whatever it is I choose to be. And so what's part of what's interesting, and you could see this in the Human Sexuality report that said pretty much nothing about transgender. And it came up, there are only little hints of it that came up in the debates during Synod. This is looming. So again, in some ways, the Christian Reformed Church is fighting the battle of the beginning of the 2010s. But people in the Christian Reformed Church are looking over their shoulder and they're in their workplace and in the rest of their life, seeing the battles of the 2020s. And so the stories in this safe harbor are blurred. Now, this gentleman, I don't remember his name, gave quite a speech on the gravamen issue on Thursday, which I'm not going to get into yet. That's something that's going to require a lot more thought and a lot more work. But the comfort and unity in doubling down on the safe harbor, again, is really present. And there's an interesting way in which it's because hard requires justification. The psychology of that is really comforting because it comes with a degree of self-righteousness. In other words, On one hand, you confess, and that's sort of humiliating. Confession makes you small. Righteous indignation makes you feel powerful. And so you can go from that mood of confession right into righteous indignation and say, okay, we're going to level up. We're going to get really hard. We're going to, and you know, both sides do this. I was once in a committee where, you know, some of the clergy abuse stuff was coming up. And someone made an argument that what we really have to do is double down and make sure that this doesn't happen, and, you know, zero tolerance, bright lines, all of that. Then I made the comment, okay, but it could be that a lot of the people who are doing this are in fact doing it because of past zero tolerance, bright lines. And maybe what you're going to need is a better combination of hard and soft. When you look at, for example, people struggling to gain sobriety or chastity, it's usually a combination of hard and soft. And in fact, authority is sort of developed through combinations of hard and soft. Some of the best teachers are both strict and loving, and figuring out that dance of strict and loving is really powerful, and that's often what people need to engage in a transformation beyond a really difficult foe. But part of the dynamic of the safe harbor, sort of the communal public safe harbor, is we can at a moment feel small and confess and have a hope of absolution, and then well up and feel powerful and strong and full of righteous anger. And it's this little dance that we do. Now, I don't know how many of you have heard of Rene Girard, but he would be very much worth looking into if you've never heard of him, because he developed the idea that we actually develop our desires together. And one of the strong dynamics of this is the scapegoat dynamic. And groups are in fact united by this scapegoat dynamic. And you see this in politics all the time, every time, and we're getting near a new presidential election. Well, Joe Biden, Joe Biden is uniting the Republicans, and Donald Trump united the Democrats and the independents, and, got him out of office. And scapegoating is a really important thing. And it can really bind a group together strongly. It can really bring a coalition together. And it's in this safe harbor that we see the scapegoat dynamic. And this intensifies the entire thing, and I think makes this conflict management even more difficult. We keep going back to it. We keep wanting to denounce the evildoers, and we can all be together on this, and we can go through this process of confession and then moral indignation. And you watch this on Wednesday. That's the note at which Wednesday left. But in the end, we overpromise setting up tomorrow where we will repeat it again. To what degree can America make up for its sins of slavery? To what degree can generations today, those who have inherited, at least in some ways, and again, you got to watch these identity inheritances because they're far more tricky. If, for example, let's say I had been abused as a child, physically abused by a man with a big black beard, and for that reason I had a bias against men with big black beards. Would I be justified to go out and harm men with big black beards? I think we could understand why, but do all men with big black beards, are they responsible? But now suppose there's a community of big black beards. Suppose I'm a McCoy and the Hatfields have always tried to keep us down. And so any Hatfield that I find, I'm going to, now, these are tremendously complex things that I'm talking about, and I don't want to just sort of put them in a low resolution and sort of reduce them that way. But this dynamic that you saw at the end of Thursday, okay, confession, we've all done wrong. Now we can all scapegoat and join in righteous indignation against, and we'll promise to work harder. We promise to do better. We'll make every classis, hold every church accountable. We're setting up the dynamic for the next generation, because it's not going to happen. And it doesn't mean that there isn't will there. Part of it is the nature of grievance. Part of it is the nature of bias. I wrote a thing on Voices that I didn't send about this. This, what we see happening at Synod, this liturgy of first confession, contrition, hope of absolution, and then turning up into scapegoat righteous indignation, we're doing it for other reasons than actually healing the wounds of the past. Partly because not all wounds of the past can be healed. And so, in many ways, what we're doing is setting up the next generation to major in grievance, and we will keep cycling this. Meanwhile, the division beneath remains, and I don't think it's going anywhere. A lot of people in the denomination have thought that time is on their side, and the thesis that I've made in a number of videos is that time probably isn't. Even in the broader culture, we're beginning to see movement on this. Ryan Burge is an outstanding researcher, and he does a lot of research in the church, and just recently he wrote this article, "Approval for Same-Sex Marriage Has Stopped Increasing." One of the most interesting trends in public opinion research over the last 20 years is the issue of same-sex marriage. The General Social Survey first asked about it in 1988. 18% of respondents said that homosexual couples should have the right to marry one another. Look at that number, 18%. Think about how fast this developed. Speed isn't necessarily a good thing with something like this. They didn't ask about it until 2004, when the share in favor had more than doubled to 37%. Don't forget, in 2008, California voted to keep same-sex marriage illegal. That number just kept racing upwards every subsequent year. By 2014, a majority favored same-sex marriage, 57%. Now, bear in mind, that means 43% do not. And bear in mind, again, the point that I've made in a lot of previous videos about the Christian Reformed Church getting more conservative. In 2018, it was 68%. Wow, that's a huge jump. In 12 years, the share of the public who favored same-sex marriage rose 33%. That's an insanely fast public opinion. But check this out. The share in favor in 2021 was 64%. The share in favor of 2022, 67%. Yeah, that progress has stalled out, maybe even reversed itself a bit. This post is about trying to sort out all this stuff. Who are the holdouts? And is it likely that there's just a ceiling in support for same-sex marriage? And again, I'll put the comment, or I'll put the link to this in the notes. Another big issue you heard a lot about on Wednesday was pastoral care. And all of these motions we need to have the denomination do pastoral care. The difference beneath the two sides means that pastoral care will look completely opposite. And you could hear that again and again. pastoral care has become in our culture nearly synonymous with being nice. Now, part of this is because of the therapeutic industry. Counselors are supposed to be nice, but if you actually talk to counselors, you'll notice that, well, remember the hard and the soft? There's not a lot of softness for certain categories of people that we can all agree with the scapegoat dynamic need to be marginalized. Pastoral care for the two groups in the Christian Reformed Church that are really in this unhappy marriage of opposites will not look the same way at all. And if you listen carefully, you can hear that, because one group says pastoral care looks like this. It looks like sort of a combination of hard and soft accountability towards the traditional stance that marriage is for heterosexual couples and chastity are for those who can't be in those relationships or don't want to be. The affirming camp will say that chastity means sex within marriage regardless of gender. Go back to my video about the church and its sex license, because they dealt with that earlier in the synod, with especially thinking about seniors and think about how the relationship between sex and marriage has changed as a society. Now, it might be swinging back, but these things take time. So this hope that, well, we can just sort of have this dynamic of mutual confession swinging around to righteous indignation, going from soft towards us, so God as soft moral improvement, towards hard moral improvement, and then remarginalizing certain groups in order to achieve moral improvement. Pastoral care will look completely opposite. I think that's the last slide that I made. Yep. So, I'm obviously going to have a lot more thoughts about Synod 2023, Thursday. I don't know that I've ever seen such a day at Synod in my adult memory. One of the good things about synods in the Christian Reformed Church is that there's usually another one. And the conversation will go on another year. It may be that this year there'll be some churches leaving to the left and some leaving to the right. I don't know. My goal in this is that we have a better conversation. My goal in this is that we understand each other a little bit better, understand the dynamics of this current moment, and maybe we can have a better confessional conversation. We can manage this conflict better, and regardless of how and where people and churches go, all of these transitions can be more productive than they've often been in the past, at least to the degree that it's possible. I'll have to see if I can upload this video from here, otherwise it'll come out late. As always, leave a comment. Let me know if you found this helpful.